Julian Thorne, a kitchen star, was a celebrity chef whose legendary temper and flawless technique had earned him worldwide acclaim. Yet, behind the brilliance lay a dark streak, one that led him to publicly humiliate his quiet black dishwasher, Marcus. When a career-defining competition hangs in the balance, Julian's entire world crumbles, forcing him to confront a difficult truth. The man he so casually scorned may hold the only key to his success, his redemption, and the true meaning of culinary excellence. The Marcus he humiliated at the food gala would end up changing not only his own life but also Julian's in a profound way. If you liked the video and have subscribed to my channel, let's move on to our story. Enjoy watching. The air in the kitchen of the Crimson Spoon was as thick as a reduction sauce, heavy with the scent of simmering stock, sizzling garlic, and the palpable tension of a chef on the brink. Julian Thorne, a man whose name was synonymous with culinary genius, stood at the pass, a sentinel of perfection. His starched white chef's jacket was a canvas of sauces and splatters, a testament to a day that had been as chaotic as a flash flood. He was an artist, a tyrant, and a legend all in one. Tonight, however, the legend felt a little more like a myth. The impending International Gastronomy Gala, a competition he had won 3 years in a row, was a weight on his shoulders, an Everest he felt compelled to climb again, higher and faster than ever before. His eyes, sharp and unforgiving, scanned every plate that left the kitchen. Nothing escaped his notice, not a stray grain of salt, not a misplaced sprig of dill. His voice was a low growl, a constant rhythm of commands and corrections that kept the rest of the staff in a state of perpetual anxious motion. Faster. The langoustines are wilting. Don't let me see another sloppy plate or I'll use it to mop the floor, he bellowed, his voice echoing off the stainless steel surfaces. In the back, a world away from the controlled chaos of the main line, was Marcus. At 22, Marcus was little more than a ghost in Julian's kingdom. His kingdom was one of gleaming dishes and unending suds. He was the dishwasher, a position of such low status that most of the cooks didn't even know his name. To them he was simply the dishwasher, a faceless cog in the machine. But Marcus was more than that. He was the quiet observer, the one who saw the flashes of brilliance and the moments of pure, unadulterated madness. He saw the way Julian's hands, so masterful with a knife, would tremble with stress. He heard the venom in Julian's words. Marcus's own world was one of necessity and quiet ambition. His hands, though perpetually pruned from the hot water and chemicals, were not idle. At home, in the small apartment he shared with his mother and younger sister, those same hands transformed into a different kind of artist. Using the few ingredients his modest wages could afford, he would create small miracles. A chicken soup so rich and comforting it could cure a cold, or a spiced rice dish that tasted of warmth and hope. He had no formal training, just a profound instinct and a love for the way food could tell a story. He dreamed of a kitchen where the shouting was replaced by laughter, where a recipe was a collaboration, not a command. But those were just dreams, and the mountains of greasy pots and pans were very real. The dinner rush was nearing its peak. The symphony of sizzling and chopping reached a frantic crescendo. Julian, inspecting a seared scallop dish, found a small, almost imperceptible smudge on the rim of the plate. A single, dark fingerprint. It was nothing. A wipe of a cloth would have fixed it. But to Julian, in that moment, it was an offense of cosmic proportions. He grabbed the plate, his face a mask of furious disbelief, and stormed to the back, his heavy footsteps thundering a warning. He found Marcus loading a rack of plates into the industrial dishwasher. "This," Julian snarled, shoving the plate toward Marcus's face, "is what you call clean?" Marcus flinched back, his eyes wide. "I'm sorry, chef. I'll rewash it. Don't you dare apologize." Julian's voice was a whip crack. "You're sorry when you do something wrong. This isn't wrong. This is negligence. This is laziness." His voice lowered, dripping with a poisonous disdain that had nothing to do with the plate. Some people, they just don't have the attention to detail. The refinement. It's not in their blood. The words hung in the air, heavy and ugly. The subtle shift from a critique of Marcus's work to an assault on his very being was a quiet, insidious cruelty. Marcus felt the heat rise in his face. It wasn't just the words. It was the look in Julian's eyes, a cold, dismissive look that said Marcus was not just a lazy employee, but a lesser human. The other kitchen staff, a mix of young line cooks and sous chefs, froze, their faces a mix of awkwardness and silent agreement. No one dared to speak. Marcus swallowed, the lump in his throat tasting like ash. He took the plate from Julian, his movements slow and deliberate, and returned it to the sink. He scrubbed it, not with anger but with a bone-deep weariness. He was used to being invisible, but this felt different. This was being seen and judged. Julian, his rage still simmering, turned on his heel and strode back to the pass. He had made his point. He had asserted his dominance. And for a moment the world felt right again. The competition, the stress, the pressure, all of it seemed a little more manageable after having a target for his frustration. He didn't think about the words he had used. He didn't think about the look on Marcus's face. He just thought about the pristine plates he would expect to see for the rest of the night. Marcus finished the last of the dishes, the silence in the back of the kitchen now a tangible weight. The other cooks eventually returned to their tasks, but the tension lingered, a dark stain on the clean white tiles. He glanced at the clock. His shift was almost over. He would go home, hug his mother, and then, in the quiet solitude of their tiny kitchen, he would make a meal. Not for a Michelin star. Not for a competition. But for his family. And for himself. He needed to remember what a real plate, a real meal truly meant. The rage had cooled, replaced by a quiet, steely resolve. He might be just a dishwasher, but he wouldn't let Julian's ugliness define him. The stench of bleach and burnt oil clung to Marcus's clothes long after he had left the steamy purgatory of the Crimson Spoon. The city bus rattled and groaned, a mechanical beast carrying him through the maze of city streets, a stark contrast to the quiet, dignified neighborhood where Julian Thorne lived. For Julian, home was a sanctuary of minimalist design and high-end appliances, a place to decompress and dream up new dishes. For Marcus, home was a third-floor walk-up in a brick building that had seen better decades, but it was a sanctuary nonetheless. It was a place where he was not a dishwasher but Marcus. He pushed open the door and the smells of his mother's cooking, a comforting blend of spices and vegetables, greeted him. His younger sister Maya was at the small kitchen table, her head bent over a worn-out textbook, a quiet force of ambition. Her dreams were as clear and bright as his were murky and undefined. She wanted to be a doctor and he was working to put her through school. It was a silent agreement between them, a shared purpose that fueled him on the long, grueling nights. "Hey Marcus," she said, looking up with a soft smile. "Mom left dinner for you." He set his worn-out bag on the floor and went to the stove. A pot of lentil stew was simmering, its warmth a soothing balm to the chill in his bones. His mother, a woman who had worked 2 jobs for as long as he could remember, was already asleep. The weariness in her face was a constant reminder of their struggle, and a powerful motivator for his quiet resolve. That night, after he had eaten, Marcus found his peace in the kitchen. He had a small chipped cutting board, a single surprisingly sharp knife he had found at a flea market, and a deep-seated love for the culinary arts. Julian's words still echoed in his mind, "It's not in their blood." But Marcus knew better. It wasn't about blood, it was about heart. He carefully chopped an onion, the tears in his eyes a release of the day's frustrations. He diced a few potatoes and added them to a skillet with a handful of spices, cumin, turmeric, and a pinch of his mother's secret blend of herbs. He wasn't following a recipe. He was listening to the food, letting the ingredients guide him. The sizzle and pop of the food in the pan was his own private symphony, a rhythm that was a world away from the frantic percussion of Julian's kitchen. Back in his pristine high-tech kitchen, Julian Thorne felt a different kind of pressure. The silence was deafening. The International Gastronomy Gala was just 3 days away, and he was still wrestling with his final dish. It had to be a revelation, a masterpiece. He had already spent tens of thousands of dollars on rare ingredients, flown in from all over the world. But something was missing. The dish, a complex composition of foie gras, truffle foam, and a reduction of aged balsamic, felt hollow. It was technically perfect, but it lacked a soul. His reputation, his very identity, rested on this dish. The insults he hurled at Marcus and the rest of his staff were not a reflection of them, but of his own deep-seated fear. The fear of being a one-trick pony, of his genius being just a flash in the pan. He paced his kitchen, his mind a whirlwind of flavors and techniques. He tried a new combination, a single, perfect scallop seared to a golden brown. He tasted it, his brow furrowed in concentration. It was good but not great. It was not a winner. He threw the plate against the wall in a fit of rage, the porcelain shattering into 100 pieces. The stress was eating him alive, a parasite feeding on his ego. The next morning, back in the fiery furnace of the Crimson Spoon, the atmosphere was even more tense. The final preparations for Julian's competition dish were underway. The sous chefs worked with the grim concentration of bomb disposal experts, knowing that one wrong move could trigger an explosion of Julian's fury. Marcus was a quiet witness to it all, a silent presence scrubbing away the stains of 1,000 meals. He saw Julian's hands, those famous, nimble hands, tremble as he shaved a delicate curl of black truffle onto a plate. He saw the sweat beading on Julian's brow. He saw the doubt in the eyes of a man who was supposed to be a god. A moment of pure chaos erupted. A young cook, distracted by the pressure, dropped a tray of delicate, pre-cooked quail eggs, sending them skittering across the floor in a symphony of crunching shells. Julian's roar was immediate and terrifying. "Are you blind, you idiot?" he screamed, his face a mask of purple-tinged fury. "That's $300 of wasted product." He stalked toward the boy, his hands balled into fists, his rage threatening to boil over. The boy stood frozen, tears welling in his eyes. In a moment of pure, unthinking impulse, Marcus acted. He stepped forward, his body a silent shield between the boy and the enraged chef. "It's okay, I'll clean it up," Marcus said, his voice quiet but firm. Julian stopped dead in his tracks, his eyes, burning with a fire of anger, fixated on Marcus. The rage that had been a general, all-consuming flame now had a specific target. "You," he spat, the word dripping with disdain. "You think this is a game? You think you can waltz in here and protect your friends? Go back to the gutter where you belong. You're nothing but a distraction." The words were a direct hit, a low blow that had nothing to do with dropped eggs and everything to do with the color of Marcus's skin. The other cooks averted their eyes, the silence in the kitchen once again a suffocating shroud. Julian turned away, his anger now channeled into a cold, menacing calm. He instructed the sous chef to start over with the quail eggs. Marcus, his heart pounding in his chest, knelt down and began to pick up the broken shells, his hands shaking slightly. Julian's words hung in the air, a poisonous gas cloud that settled over the kitchen. He was no longer just the dishwasher, he was a troublemaker, a problem. Julian had not only judged him, but had condemned him to a place he felt he belonged. But as he wiped the floor, Marcus realized that Julian's ugliness was not a reflection of his own worth. Julian, for all his genius, was a broken man, a prisoner of his own success. And in that moment, Marcus felt not anger but a strange kind of pity. He finished cleaning the mess, his hands steady once more, the quiet, unspoken resolve he had found the night before, now hardened into an unshakable steel. The International Gastronomy Gala was a stage of controlled artifice, a brightly lit arena where the world's most celebrated chefs battled for supremacy. The air hummed with the energy of 1,000 hushed voices and the low, constant whir of cameras. Julian Thorne, a three-time champion, stood on a raised platform, a lone figure in a sea of flashing lights. His station was a study in immaculate order, gleaming knives, perfectly portioned ingredients, and an array of sophisticated tools. He felt the eyes of the world on him, and with them came a familiar, suffocating pressure. He was a gladiator in a white jacket, and his sword was a chef's knife. Julian's grand plan, his piece de resistance, was a testament to his technical brilliance. Pan-seared scallops on a bed of cauliflower puree, with a truffle foam and a garnish of microgreens. The centerpiece, however, was a rare and impossibly delicate Japanese truffle, flown in just for this event. Its earthy aroma was meant to be the final, breathtaking note, the one that would guarantee his victory. The first few steps of the competition were a blur of masterful precision. His hands moved with a familiar, almost automatic grace, a choreography of a man at the height of his powers. The scallops seared to a perfect golden brown, the puree was smooth and velvety, and the microgreens were placed with the precision of a surgeon. Everything was going according to plan. The crowd watched with bated breath, mesmerized by his every move. But as he reached for the truffle, his hand, so steady just moments before, began to tremble. A bead of sweat, cold and clammy, trickled down his temple. He had been working on this dish for months, perfecting every detail, and the strain was finally getting to him. The truffles were in a small, elegant box, cushioned to protect their fragile form. He lifted the lid, his heart a drumbeat in his ears. And then it happened. His hand, shaking with the stress of the moment, slipped. The box tumbled from his grasp, turning in the air in slow motion. The crowd collectively gasped. The truffle, a small dark jewel worth more than his monthly rent, hit the floor with a soft, final thud. It didn't shatter, but it was ruined. The delicate fungi was bruised, a crack running through its center. It was no longer a perfect gem, but a symbol of his impending failure. In the viewing area backstage, a small humble figure watched the live feed. Marcus had taken the day off from the Crimson Spoon. He wasn't there for Julian. He was there to see a different world, to breathe the air of a place where food was celebrated and not just a means to an end. He saw Julian's face, a mask of absolute horror as the truffle fell. And he felt a pang of something he hadn't expected, a strange, complicated pity. The anger he felt just days before was gone, replaced by a clear-eyed understanding of the burden Julian carried. He saw a man who had built his entire life on perfection, only to have it crumble at the most critical moment. Julian was frozen. His mind, so sharp and quick, was now a blank. He had no backup truffle. There was no time to get one. The clock was ticking down, and he was staring at a ruined dish and a broken dream. The cameras zoomed in on his face, a raw portrait of defeat. He was just a moment away from walking away from his station and giving up. But then, through the crowd, his eyes found a familiar face, the face of the quiet dishwasher from his kitchen. Marcus. Julian's expression, so recently filled with panic, was replaced by a flicker of a wild, desperate hope. He knew he was a fool, but he was drowning. He gestured to Marcus, a frantic, almost imperceptible flick of his hand. Marcus, seeing the signal, didn't hesitate. He wove through the throng of onlookers, the security guards and the camera crews, until he reached the edge of the stage. He approached the platform and Julian leaned down, his voice a low, urgent whisper, a desperate plea for a miracle. "What do I do? It's gone. It's over." Marcus didn't answer right away. He looked at Julian's face, a mix of arrogance and absolute vulnerability, and then at the dish, the flawless scallops, the creamy puree. And then he saw it. The solution. He pointed to a small side plate on Julian's station. "The black garlic," he said, his voice barely audible over the din of the crowd. Julian stared at the plate of fermented black garlic, a common, inexpensive ingredient. "Are you mad?" he hissed. "I can't use that. This is a world-class competition, not a street food festival." Marcus's eyes, quiet and steady, held his gaze. "It's not just black garlic," he insisted. "You cook it down in a little butter and honey. It turns into a sweet, earthy paste. It's not a truffle, but the flavor is deep, complex. We'll surprise them. It'll give the dish a soul." The words, so simple and true, cut through the noise of Julian's panic. Julian stared at the garlic and then back at Marcus, a man he had called a lesser human. He had no other option. With trembling hands, he grabbed the pan and followed Marcus's simple instructions, his mind working furiously to trust this man he barely knew. He sautéed the black garlic with honey and butter, a rich, dark sauce forming in the pan. The scent was intoxicating, a sweet, earthy aroma that was entirely new and unexpected. He swirled a small amount onto the plate, the dark, beautiful paste a striking contrast to the white of the puree. He placed the scallops on top and garnished them with the microgreens. The result was not the dish he had planned. It was something different, something bold, something that had a life of its own. He looked at Marcus, and for the first time, Julian saw not a dishwasher, but a man who had saved him. He presented the dish to the judges, his heart pounding, a strange sense of fear and exhilaration coursing through him. He watched their faces as they took their first bite. Their expressions were unreadable at first, but then the smallest of smiles. A nod. A quiet murmur of approval. He knew. He had done it. But this time, the victory was not his alone. The final minutes of the International Gastronomy Gala felt like an eternity. Julian stood at his station, a statue of nervous energy, his gaze fixed on the panel of judges. The dish he had presented was not his original creation, not the one he had painstakingly planned, but something born of a moment of panic and the quiet brilliance of a man he had dismissed. He saw their faces, a mixture of solemn concentration and quiet delight. They whispered to each other, took a final taste, and then, in a single, synchronized gesture, they laid down their forks. The verdict was in. The lead judge, a stern-faced woman with a reputation for being impossible to impress, took the microphone. This year's competition was a showcase of technical skill and culinary artistry. The level of perfection on display was breathtaking. However, she paused, her eyes sweeping over the assembled chefs. A true master is not defined by their ability to execute a plan flawlessly, but by their capacity to adapt, to innovate, and to find the soul in their food when all seems lost. She turned her gaze directly to Julian. This year's winner, for a fourth consecutive time, is Julian Thorne of the Crimson Spoon. A thunderous applause erupted, a wave of sound that washed over Julian, but it felt different this time. It was the same adulation he had received before, the same shouts of praise, but the victory felt different. Hollow in a way. He walked to the center of the stage, the heavy gold medal placed around his neck, its weight a physical manifestation of his achievement. He offered a practiced, triumphant smile to the cameras, but his eyes, for just a moment, found Marcus in the crowd. There was a shared look, a silent acknowledgement of a truth only the two of them knew. The truffles, the money, the months of preparation, all of it had been for nothing. His victory was a borrowed one. Later, in the controlled chaos of the backstage area, Julian was surrounded by reporters, their questions a rapid-fire assault of praise and curiosity. What was the inspiration for the sauce? How did you manage to create a dish with such a unique flavor profile under such pressure? Julian's answers were vague, evasive. He spoke of culinary instinct and creative improvisation, his ego, for the first time in a long time, held in check by a newfound humility. He was a master of his craft, but tonight he had also been a student. He finally excused himself from the press, his eyes scanning the crowd, looking for a quiet presence he had once so callously dismissed. He found Marcus standing by the fire exit, a solitary figure in a plain t-shirt and jeans. He looked a world away from the pristine glamour of the gala. "Marcus," Julian said, his voice softer than he had intended. Marcus turned, a flicker of surprise in his eyes. He seemed ready to bolt, to retreat back into the comfortable invisibility he had known for so long. "Chef," he said, his tone respectful but distant. Julian took a step closer. The air between them was thick with unspoken words. "You saved me," Julian said, the words feeling foreign and clumsy on his tongue. "That dish, it wasn't mine. It was ours." Marcus shook his head. "It was your dish, chef. I just gave you a suggestion." "No. A suggestion is a different kind of basil or a touch of cayenne. You gave me the missing piece. The soul," Julian said, the words feeling true in his mouth. He looked at Marcus, really looked at him, and saw not a dishwasher, not a cog in the machine, but a quiet, powerful mind. "What were you doing here tonight?" Marcus hesitated, then the words spilled out. I love cooking. I don't have any training, but I watch a lot of videos. I read books. I experiment at home. I just wanted to see what it was like, to see the best chefs in the world. I wanted to learn." Julian listened, a strange mix of emotions swirling inside him. He was a man who had built his career on a foundation of technique and tradition, but here was a young man with nothing but a raw, unadulterated passion. The black garlic, the honey. Where did you get that idea? "My mother," Marcus said with a small smile. "She makes a stew with black garlic and honey. It's comforting. It's real. It has a story." Julian felt a profound shift within him. The truffles he had so painstakingly imported were expensive and rare, but they had no story. They were a status symbol. The black garlic, a humble ingredient, was a testament to a life, a history, a family. "I was wrong about you, Marcus," Julian said, his voice barely a whisper. "I was wrong about a lot of things. The things I said, they were unforgivable. I was under pressure, but that's not an excuse. I'm sorry." The apology, raw and unexpected, hung in the air. Marcus looked at Julian, seeing the man behind the mask of arrogance for the first time. "I appreciate that, chef," he said simply. Julian took a deep breath, and a new idea, a new kind of challenge formed in his mind. He wasn't just a chef, he was an innovator. "I can't do this alone," he said, the words surprising even himself. "I can't continue to run my kitchen as a place of fear and intimidation. It's not sustainable, and it's not who I want to be anymore. I need a change. I need a different kind of genius. I need you." He took another breath. "Don't quit. Don't quit being a dishwasher." "But What do you say to a promotion? Come work on the line. I want you to be my new sous chef. He saw the shock on Marcus's face. Let me teach you what I know. But more importantly, you can teach me what I've forgotten. Marcus was speechless. He had walked into the gala as an anonymous dishwasher, a ghost in a world he so desperately wanted to be a part of. And now, the man who had verbally abused him just days before, a man who had won the most prestigious culinary prize in the world, was offering him a place at his side. He looked at Julian's hand, extended to him in a gesture of truce, and he felt a world of possibilities opening up before him. The memory of the black garlic and honey, of the simple comfort of his mother's cooking, was a reminder of why he had dreamed in the first place. He could have a new life, a new beginning in the most unlikely of places. He could rise not from the ashes but from the suds. The turning point has arrived. Marcus has a chance to step out of the shadows and into the light. What will his new role be like? And how will the other cooks in the kitchen react to this sudden shift in power? The victory lap was over, but the aftermath lingered in the air like a persistent, buttery haze. The kitchen of the Crimson Spoon, usually a high-octane symphony of stainless steel and sharp commands, was now a low murmur of bewildered whispers. The news of Julian Thorne's unexpected fourth win was a surprise, but the bigger bombshell was the quiet, almost unbelievable rumor that the dishwasher, Marcus, was now the new sous chef. When Marcus walked through the staff entrance that morning, the air crackled with a new kind of tension. He wasn't in his faded t-shirt and work pants. He wore a crisp, white chef's jacket, a uniform he had only ever seen from a distance. It was ill-fitting, a little too tight in the shoulders and a little too long in the sleeves, a physical manifestation of his new awkward position. He walked past the gleaming dishwasher, a silent tomb of his recent past, and stepped onto the line. His hands no longer smelling of industrial soap, but of fresh ginger and cilantro he had worked with at home, felt both alien and completely natural. The other cooks, who had barely acknowledged his existence for months, now watched him with a mix of disbelief, resentment, and reluctant curiosity. Leo, the young cook who had dropped the quail eggs, gave him a small, nervous nod. But the most palpable animosity came from Pierre, the former sous chef, who had been unceremoniously dismissed with a curt text message from Julian just hours after the gala. Pierre, a man of 20 years' experience, stood in a huddle with a few other longtime staff members, his face a mask of bitter fury. He had been Julian's right hand for a decade, and now that position belonged to a kid from the dish pit. Julian, true to his word, had changed. He wasn't shouting. He was speaking, his voice still firm, but with a new, almost paternal tone. He called the entire staff to the center of the kitchen. "Marcus will be my new sous chef," Julian announced, his gaze unwavering. "His passion and his instincts are what this kitchen needs. The days of shouting and fear are over. We will work together. We will elevate our craft. We will cook with our hearts, not just our hands." The words were met with a wall of silent skepticism. Julian turned to Marcus. "Marcus, for today's lunch service, I want you to be in charge of the scallop station. I'll be observing. I want to see how you run things. I want to see what you've got." The task was a deliberate challenge. It was Julian's most famous and difficult dish, a test of pure skill and composure under fire. The weight of the moment was not lost on Marcus. He had to prove not just his talent but his right to be there. The lunch rush began and the familiar rhythm of the kitchen took over. The sizzle of the pans, the clang of the pots, the rapid-fire calls for orders. It was a world he had only ever heard from the back. He stood at the scallop station, a single perfect spatula in his hand, his mind a whirlwind of information. He had watched Julian make this dish hundreds of times. He had memorized every movement, every ingredient, every precise temperature. But watching was not the same as doing. A torrent of orders for scallops came in. "2 scallops, please. 1 medium rare, 1 medium." The voice belonged to Pierre, who was now working as a line cook, a deliberate demotion that Julian had orchestrated. Pierre's voice was laced with a sneering condescension. Marcus took a deep breath. He took 2 scallops from the ice-filled tray, his hands moving with a fluid grace that surprised even him. He seasoned them, carefully placed them in the hot pan, and watched as they sizzled and turned a perfect golden brown. He flipped them at just the right moment, his hands steady, his mind completely focused. He placed them on the plate with the perfect puree, drizzled the black garlic and honey sauce over them, and garnished them with microgreens. He had done it. They were perfect. Pierre, however, was not impressed. He scoffed, loud enough for Julian to hear. "Looks like a kid's play food. You can't learn this in a day. He's all instinct, no technique. He's going to ruin everything." The other cooks shifted uncomfortably, avoiding eye contact. Julian, who had been observing from a distance, said nothing. This was Marcus's moment to prove himself. Marcus finished the order and placed the plate on the pass. He turned to Pierre, his gaze calm and unwavering. "My technique might not be what you're used to, but it works," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "I don't need to follow a recipe to the letter. I need to understand what the food is telling me." He turned back to his station, his actions speaking louder than his words. An hour into the lunch service, a crisis struck. The emulsified butter for the seared salmon dish, a delicate and temperamental sauce, suddenly broke. The rich, golden liquid separated into a greasy pool and a watery mess. The line cook in charge of the dish panicked. He had tried everything, whisking it furiously, adding more butter, but nothing worked. The clock was ticking and the orders for salmon were piling up. Pierre, seeing an opportunity to humiliate Marcus, stepped forward. "I told you," he said loud enough for the whole kitchen to hear. "He's a mess. He's going to bring this whole place down." Marcus stepped away from his station. He walked over to the sauce, a quiet sense of purpose in his eyes. He didn't touch it. He simply looked at it, his mind processing the problem in a way that had nothing to do with culinary school and everything to do with pure instinct. "It's too hot," he said calmly. "It broke from the heat. Don't add more butter. Just take it off the heat and whisk in a few drops of cold water. It will bring it back together." The line cook, desperate, did as Marcus instructed. He took the pan off the heat, added a few drops of cold water, and with a few gentle rhythmic whisks, the sauce came back together, a smooth, golden emulsion once again. A few of the cooks let out a quiet, collective sigh of relief. Pierre's jaw tightened. Julian, who had been watching the entire exchange, walked over to Marcus. He placed a hand on his shoulder, a simple, supportive gesture that was a universe away from his past behavior. "I told you all," he said, his voice loud and clear, "this man is a genius. He saw a solution where no one else did. I'm proud to have him as my second in command." The words were a quiet, powerful declaration. The message was clear. Marcus was not a temporary fixture. He was here to stay. And for the first time, a hesitant, but undeniable, respect began to form in the eyes of the other cooks. The new order in the kitchen of the Crimson Spoon was a quiet, almost tentative thing, like the first notes of a new symphony. Julian Thorne was no longer the roaring tyrant, but the patient conductor. He moved with a new purpose, his commands no longer laced with threats, but with a quiet sense of instruction. The change was not lost on the staff. They were still wary, still on edge, but the fear had been replaced by a cautious curiosity. They watched Marcus, the former dishwasher, move with a newfound confidence, his crisp, white jacket now fitting him a little better, as if his growing confidence had filled it out. The real test of this new dynamic came a few days later when Julian was tasked with creating a special tasting menu for a visiting food critic from Paris, a woman known for her brutally honest reviews. Julian was meticulous, planning a 6-course meal that was a showcase of his technical prowess. Every dish was a complex puzzle of flavors, textures, and temperatures. The final dish, a delicate sea base with a wild mushroom risotto and a foamy saffron emulsion, was the capstone. It was a dish Julian had made 1,000 times, each one as perfect as the last. But as he worked on the risotto, a familiar frustration began to creep in. He had used the finest carnaroli rice, the best stock, and a rare, pungent porcini mushroom, yet something was off. The risotto was creamy, the rice cooked to a perfect al dente, but the flavor was flat, one-dimensional. It lacked depth. It lacked soul. He tried adding more mushroom. He tried a touch of white wine. Nothing. His mind, so used to a formulaic approach, was stuck. He felt the old pressure rising in his chest, a ghost of his past. He fought the urge to smash the bowl on the floor, to scream at the cooks, to lose himself in a familiar, destructive rage. Marcus, who was working on the side, quietly dicing vegetables with a newfound precision, saw the subtle tension in Julian's shoulders. He saw the way Julian's brow furrowed, the telltale sign of a mind at its limit. He had seen this before, but in a different context. He had seen it from the back of the kitchen, through the din of a busy dinner service. Now he was right there, a witness to the legendary chef's silent struggle. Marcus approached him cautiously, a small bowl in his hands. "Chef," he said, his voice low and respectful. "I know this is a foolish thing to suggest, but maybe a different kind of broth?" Julian looked at him, his eyes filled with a weary frustration. "What do you mean? This is the best vegetable stock money can buy. It's been reduced for 6 hours. It's flawless." Marcus set the bowl on the counter, revealing a small, unassuming concoction inside. It was a broth he had made from scratch, from the scraps of roasted carrots, onions, and celery he had saved from the previous day's prep. He had simmered it for hours, adding a single smoked paprika pod and a few cloves of roasted garlic. The scent was earthy, smoky, and complex. It was not a flawless broth. It was a rustic one. "It's not just vegetable stock," Marcus explained. "It's a memory. A flavor from my grandmother's kitchen. I added a little smoked paprika to give it a warmth, a kind of depth that you can only get from a wood-fired stove." Julian stared at the bowl, his mind at war with itself. Every fiber of his being, every tenet of his culinary training, screamed at him to dismiss this. It was an anathema to his high-end, precise cooking style. Smoked paprika? In a fine dining risotto? It was madness. But the scent of the broth, earthy and profound, was a siren's call to his senses. He picked up a spoonful and tasted it. The flavor was a revelation. It was not just savory, it was comforting. It had a story. It was the missing piece. He turned to Marcus, a flicker of raw astonishment in his eyes. "You made this from scraps?" he asked, a quiet disbelief in his voice. Marcus nodded, a small, humble smile on his face. "It's what we do at home. Nothing goes to waste. My mom taught me that." Julian looked at the risotto bowl, then back at the broth. He took the risotto, poured the entire bowl into a fresh pan, and began to stir in Marcus's humble broth. He watched as the flavors came together, the blandness of his perfect risotto replaced by a profound, smoky depth. It wasn't just a new flavor, it was a new perspective. The other cooks, who had been watching the entire exchange, were stunned into silence. They had expected Julian to explode, to lash out, to humiliate Marcus. But instead they saw him listen. They saw him learn. They saw the legend, the man who had won 4 championships, humbled by a simple broth made from scraps. Later that evening, the food critic, a woman with a face as unreadable as a sphinx, tasted the risotto. She paused, her eyes closed, savoring the flavor. She looked up at Julian, a genuine smile on her face. "Chef Thorne," she said, her voice a low purr. "I have eaten 1,000 risottos in my life, and they have all been perfect. But this one has a soul. What is your secret?" Julian looked at Marcus, who was standing quietly in the background, a small, triumphant smile on his face. Julian looked back at the critic, and for the first time in his career, the answer was a simple, honest truth. "It's not a secret," he said, his eyes meeting Marcus's. "It's collaboration. I learned it from my new sous chef. He taught me that sometimes, the most profound flavors are born not from perfection, but from heart." The words were a quiet, powerful declaration. A new chapter in the Crimson Spoon had truly begun. The once pristine harmony of the Crimson Spoon was now a delicate and at times discordant new melody. Julian's new collaborative approach had brought a fresh energy, a sense of creative freedom that was inspiring to most of the staff. The kitchen was quieter, the food was more soulful, and the atmosphere was one of mutual respect. But not for everyone. For Pierre, the former sous chef, the new order was a betrayal, a slap in the face. He was a man of tradition, of strict hierarchy, and Julian's sudden shift felt like a personal attack on everything he had dedicated his life to. Marcus, the quiet dishwasher who had stolen his position, was a constant, bitter reminder of his fall from grace. He watched Marcus with a cold, simmering resentment, his mind a cauldron of revenge. The opportunity for sabotage arrived in the form of a private dinner for an influential group of food investors, the kind of people who could make or break a restaurant with a single, bad review. Julian, eager to showcase the new direction of his cuisine, had planned a masterpiece, a deconstructed French onion soup with a rich, savory broth, a slice of perfectly toasted brioche, and a blanket of aged Gruyere. The broth, a slow-simmered, complex concoction of caramelized onions, beef bones, and fine port, was the heart of the dish. The evening was a blur of seamless execution. Orders were called out, plates were assembled with a new, quiet efficiency. Julian stood at the pass, a calm, confident presence. The new dynamic was working. The team was a well-oiled machine, and the food leaving the kitchen was exceptional. But as the time for the soup course approached, a familiar unease began to gnaw at Marcus. He was plating the toasted brioche, his mind a whirlwind of small, nagging details, when he noticed Pierre, who was supposed to be setting up the dessert station, lingering near the simmering pots of soup broth. Pierre's back was to him, and he was doing something with his hands, something that made Marcus's stomach clench with an inexplicable dread. Marcus went to the broth, his movements casual, and took a small taste. It was perfect, rich and savory. He dismissed his fear as paranoia. Then, a few minutes later, as he was about to ladle the broth into the serving bowls, he took another taste. The flavor was different. The beautiful, complex symphony of flavors was gone, replaced by a harsh, almost acrid aftertaste. Something was horribly wrong. He looked at Julian, a silent plea for help in his eyes. Julian tasted the broth, and his face, once calm and confident, turned to a mask of horrified disbelief. "What is this?" he whispered. "It tastes like burnt sugar. It's ruined." The investors were waiting. There was no time to make a new broth. Julian, his heart sinking, had no choice but to serve the ruined soup. He apologized to the guests, but the damage was done. They took one sip, their faces a mixture of confusion and disgust. The head investor, a formidable woman with a reputation for being ruthless, laid down her spoon. "Julian," she said, her voice a cold whisper that carried across the quiet room. "This is not the standard we expected from you. It tastes bitter. You've lost your touch." The rest of the dinner was a quiet, agonizing affair. The investors left early, their business cards left untouched on the table, their interest in the Crimson Spoon, and its new direction, gone. The kitchen was a mausoleum of broken dreams. The staff was frozen, a silent, heartbroken testament to the ruined night. Julian stood at the pass, his shoulders slumped in defeat. This was a deeper loss than his ruined truffle. This was a professional humiliation, a public failure that could cost him everything. He looked at Marcus, the man he had trusted to help him turn his kitchen around, and a wave of raw frustration coursed through him. "What happened?" he said, the words a low, pained growl. "How could this happen?" Marcus looked at Pierre, who was nonchalantly wiping down a counter, a small, knowing smirk playing on his lips. Marcus swallowed, the lump in his throat tasting like the ruined broth. He knew. But he had no proof. He stepped toward Julian, his voice a low, firm whisper. I think someone did this on purpose." Julian's eyes, filled with a new, dangerous fury, met Marcus's. He saw the quiet conviction in his eyes, and he followed his gaze. He looked at Pierre, his face a mask of feigned innocence, and then he looked back at Marcus. The betrayal was palpable, a dark stain on the clean white tiles. Julian was a master of his craft, but he was also a man who had made powerful enemies. He knew instinctively that his former sous chef had exacted his revenge. The confrontation, quiet and tense, hung in the air like a final, poisonous gas cloud. The kitchen, a place of 100 victories and 1,000 defeats, had never felt so quiet. The clatter of plates and the sizzle of pans were replaced by a funereal silence. The staff stood in a daze, their faces pale with shock. The failure of the soup was more than a mistake. It was a public humiliation that threatened to unravel everything Julian had worked for. Julian stood at the pass, his face a storm of rage and despair, his fists clenched so tight his knuckles were white. He was a man who had lost his touch, his reputation, and his composure in a single bitter moment. Marcus, seeing the raw agony on Julian's face, knew this was not a time for silence. He had to act. He walked toward Julian, the once unapproachable chef, and placed a hand on his shoulder. "Chef," he said, his voice calm and steady, "I know who did this, and I think I know how to fix it." Julian looked at him, his eyes filled with a desperate, questioning fury. "Pierre," Julian whispered, the word laced with a cold, vengeful certainty. "He poisoned the soup with burnt sugar. He used it to ruin me." The rage was a wildfire in his eyes, a familiar, destructive energy. "I'll call the police. I'll destroy his career. I'll make him pay for this." But Marcus shook his head. Revenge won't save the restaurant, chef. It won't bring the investors back. It won't fix the bad taste in their mouths. We have to do something that is so unexpected, so powerful, that it will make them forget this ever happened. He spoke not as a dishwasher or even as a sous chef, but as a leader. We have to call them back. We have to show them what we're really made of. Julian stared at him, his fury slowly giving way to a bewildered disbelief. Are you mad? They just left. They'll never come back. And even if they do, what will we cook? There's no time to prepare another tasting menu. We won't make a tasting menu, Marcus said, his voice brimming with conviction. We'll make a single dish. One that has a story. One that has soul. We'll make them a meal that they'll remember, not for its technical perfection, but for its honesty. He looked at Julian, a silent, powerful plea in his eyes. We need to show them the real heart of this kitchen. The heart that you've been so afraid to show them. Julian hesitated. He had a choice to make. He could descend into a vengeful rage and destroy his former sous chef, or he could take a leap of faith, trusting a man he had once called a lesser human. He looked at Marcus's face, a picture of quiet conviction and unshakable courage. Julian saw not a dishwasher, but a man who understood the profound, unspoken truth of his new culinary philosophy. What's the dish? Julian asked, the question a quiet surrender to his new path. Marcus's face broke into a small, hopeful smile. I'll show you. An hour later, the investors, lured back by a cryptic but intriguing phone call from Julian, sat at the same table, their faces a mix of skepticism and curiosity. The kitchen was a flurry of activity, but it was a different kind of energy. It was a collaboration. Marcus was at the center, his hands moving with the grace of a seasoned professional. He took a humble chicken, a handful of rice, and a few simple vegetables, the kind of ingredients Julian would never have dared to serve to his guests. He seasoned the rice with the same blend of spices he had used at home, a complex aroma of cumin and coriander filling the air. Julian, for his part, was not just observing. He was assisting, his famous hands now working to elevate Marcus's humble ingredients. He taught Marcus how to perfectly sauté the vegetables, how to create a delicate foam with milk and a touch of saffron, a small nod to his own culinary past, but in service of a new vision. They presented the dish together, a quiet, united front. It was a single plate of spiced rice, a piece of perfectly seared chicken, and a drizzle of the saffron foam. It was not a masterpiece of technique, but a testament to a newfound partnership. Julian watched as the head investor took a bite. She chewed slowly, her face unreadable. Then a small, genuine smile spread across her lips. This, she said, her voice filled with a quiet surprise, is the most memorable thing I have ever eaten. It is not just food. It is a story. It has a soul. The rest of the investors agreed. They saw not a grand, pretentious meal, but an honest, heartfelt dish. A dish that spoke of collaboration, of redemption, and of the profound truth that the most powerful art is born not from perfection, but from the heart. They chose to invest in the Crimson Spoon, not because Julian was a winner, but because he had chosen to embrace a new kind of victory. Pierre, the man who had tried to destroy the restaurant, was now just a memory, his bitterness a final, bitter note in a symphony of new beginnings. And Julian, the man who had once shouted at a poor black dishwasher, had not only won the cooking competition, but had also won something far more valuable. He had found a true partner and a new, more meaningful way to cook. He looked at Marcus, his face filled with a quiet gratitude, and for the first time Julian Thorne, the famous chef, felt like his journey had truly begun. Dear viewer, if you've watched up to this point, thank you for your support. I have a small request. If you enjoy my stories, you can subscribe to the channel, and don't hesitate to share your thoughts about the stories in the comments. Enjoy watching. Thank you for listening. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and like the video.